Hey guys, it's Kevin, my review for Tom and Jerry. So what Tom and Jerry is essentially about is basically we center on, well, Tom and Jerry. They have just gotten kicked out of their apartment after, a bunch of destruction and things like that, and they end up going over to this hotel where we then focus on this character, Kayla, who has recently gotten a job there after basically conning her way into it, and she basically has to do what she can to try to put together this very extravagant and expensive wedding for this very famous couple, but also tries to keep Tom and Jerry at bay, especially when Jerry starts to wreak havoc. She decides to hire Tom as basically the person that is going to catch him and hopefully just make sure the wedding goes off without a hitch. So Tom and Jerry overall, I was not really excited for this film, understandably. I feel like a lot of these live-action animated hybrids, a lot of them just kind of feel the same. They're movies where I watch them and I'm like, why do these exist? Why do we need them? And Tom and Jerry definitely felt their evils, I would say. It definitely felt like one of those films that didn't look terrible or anything, but I really wasn't too excited for it either. It just kind of seemed like one of those movies that would just kind of come out and I'd watch, and that's kind of really it. And yeah, that is the case. This movie isn't terrible. In fact, Tom and Jerry does have some legitimately really fun moments, but it's really bogged down by a very cliche and very predictable story that we really have seen a lot of times before and doesn't really do much of anything to really stick out, but we are just getting into right now, starting off with the cast. I will say, in terms of acting here, the acting really isn't that bad. I don't really think anyone is giving a bad performance in this film. Let's talk about Chloë Grace Moretz. I've talked about before how she's a very likable actress in that way. She's someone that can really turn a bad script and elevate it, and she definitely does do that here. The character of Kayla we'll get into in a little bit, but Moretz is generally very likable in the role. She definitely does a good job of making this character likable, and I think giving this character a few more layers that she didn't already have, but she also is definitely having a lot of fun. It doesn't feel like she's phoning it in or anything. It feels like she generally does want to be here, and I think overall she did do a really good job. Same goes for Michael Peña, who definitely, is not given nearly the amount of funny material that we might want him to have, but he does do a good job in this film. Terrence is a character that is very cynical. He doesn't love a lot of what's going on with Tom and Jerry, and he definitely does, do a good job at playing this role overall. I overall was impressed by him, and I think Moretz and Peña overall worked very well together. Rob Delaney also does a good job, I think, as DeBro, who is the manager of this hotel. He definitely is a lot of fun. He's a bit of an idiot, but you can tell he really is relishing the part overall. A big surprise for me, I would say, is Patsy Ferran, who plays this character Joy. I thought she was maybe the standout of the entire movie in terms of comedy. If it wasn't for Tom and Jerry, I think she definitely is the standout here. This is a very awkward character that we have seen a lot of times before, but something about Ferran's delivery, it just really worked for me, and I thought she was definitely one of the highlights throughout this entire film, and I really did like what she ended up doing here. Even Colin Jost, an actor I don't normally like, he actually did a good job in this film. Ken Yeon was surprisingly not bad either. The character he's playing, it's not a big role, but I think he overall did do a good job. Really, all of these actors, I mean, there's nothing really wrong with them, and I think overall, again, in terms of the cast here, everyone is pretty solid. Now let's get to the directing and the writing, because this is where we get to the stuff that really just doesn't work in this film. I always thought going into this film that Tim Story was a very strange choice as a director, but watching, and I didn't really understand why they chose him. I mean, this is the guy who, yes, he did 2 Fantastic Four movies, but he also did a lot of very raunchy comedies that kids definitely haven't seen and aren't the target audience for, so I just didn't really understand why they picked him, and after watching this movie, I'm even more more confused because I just don't think his directing is anything that great. I don't think there's anything he really added to this film in terms of style. I don't think he did anything here to really make this work in like anything that didn't feel like other live action hybrid films that have come before it, and I just wasn't that overly impressed by his directing here. I will definitely say he didn't do anything to ruin Tom and Jerry, so I will definitely give him that, but I just don't think directing wise there's anything really that special here. Writing as well definitely leaves a lot to be desired. Now, I will say right now, when the film is focusing on our titular duo of Tom and Jerry, it's actually a lot of fun. Just seeing these two chase each other and really just the simplicity of it all. I think that's something that really does work. It really does work for both of these characters, but again, it's the simplicity. Tom, in this film, he is a piano player. He wants to play the piano, but Jerry consistently is thwarting these, is doing everything he can to try to ruin that dream and crush it in any way that he can, and it's honestly really fun to watch. Just see the back and forth between those two. That's when this film really does soar. That's when this film really did generally have me smiling, and I think they did a good job with that, and that's something that I will absolutely give this film. I feel like a lot of live-action animated hybrid films, they don't understand what worked about the original cartoon. Tom and Jerry very much does. They definitely did not do anything to change these characters. They kept the simplicity of it. They didn't have them talk like in another movie, which, God, I don't want to talk about that one. And it generally works, in terms of these characters. So I think in terms of that definitely does work. If the entire movie was just Tom and Jerry chasing each other, then I really would not be complaining. But sadly, that is not the case here. The main story we're dealing with here is one that is just very generic and one that we've seen a lot of times before. We have these human characters that are not very well developed, they're not very interesting, and there just isn't a lot about them that you really do find yourself gravitating to. I mean, Kayla as a main character isn't bad. I've seen a lot of people talk about how, she has this really bad introduction where she basically is, hijacking this woman's interview. This woman is trying to get hired, and, she ends up basically conning her way through it, but I thought it was kind of a fun dilemma for the character because she does kind of realize, what she's going through. She does become a better person as a result, and that's kind of like her whole arc in this movie, is that her working at this hotel, it gets her to become a better person. And yes, it's a very surface level dilemma, but it does kind of work because Kayla as a character, you do find yourself gravitating towards. You do find yourself wanting things to work out for her because she is the most well-developed character in this movie, albeit there's not much to her. I mean, for example, the beginning of this film, we see her being fired from a job, but we don't know what this job was. We don't know what the significance of this was to her. We really don't know too much about her. It's really just something about, it's really just Moretz's performance that does make her likable. But as a character, there really just isn't all that much to Kayla, and I would have really liked them to dive into her a bit more, and I think she could have become a better character as a result. And same goes for virtually every other human in this movie. Michael Peña plays this character Terrence, who goes in a very predictable direction. He's someone that, he doesn't like Kayla being in this job. He wants to do everything he can to kind of ruin things for her and, get her, away from this position, especially because she's like threatening a position that he really wants. And again, it just goes in a very predictable direction, and they just don't do anything all that different with it. And I think that definitely does bring it down. I think what actually could have worked is if these characters were as wacky as Tom and Jerry, which they're really not. There are some side characters, like Ken Yan plays this chef that is just so he's so dedicated to what he does, and he's so wacky in that way, but it's a side character. It's not the main character of this movie, and Kayla is just far too boring for what's going on. It also doesn't help that a good portion of this movie is centering on this married couple that we just don't give a shit about. They just seem very rich and snobby, and there just isn't really a lot to them as characters. Yes, we have this whole thing with them wanting this extravagant wedding, but then kind of learning that they don't really need to, rely as much on that. But other than that, there just really isn't a lot to care about in terms of these characters. And again, it really just comes down to Tom and Jerry and the inherent likability of them, and that can only take you so far in a film, because when the film is not focusing on them, it's not very funny. Yes, you have that one character I mentioned, but that's only one character. The other stuff that's going on in this movie, it just isn't very funny or entertaining, because, well, we've really just seen it a bunch of times before. The bland human characters, I just don't understand why we continue to make movies like this. Why do studios think that we're gonna care about this? Why do studios think that this is the thing we want to focus on? I just don't really understand what they're trying to do here, especially because, like, these aren't, like, characters that were in the original film. It's different when you had Alvin and the Chipmunks and you focus in on Dave. That I understand because he was in the original cartoon, but, like, here, I just don't understand why we're focusing on these characters and not on the titular duo that we really want to focus on in this film. So I think the writing overall here, it's not terrible or anything, it's just very subpar, and I think definitely could have turned out a lot better with much better writing for sure. The animation here, though, is surprisingly really good. The way that Tom and Jerry look especially, it feels very fluid. They blend in very nicely with this world, and I think they do a good job with that. Even some of the other characters, it's not just Tom and Jerry. You also have Spike the dog, and he really doesn't look too bad either. He doesn't play a huge role in this film, though. You think he's going to, but they don't really do too much with him at all, but he doesn't look terrible or anything. I think overall the animation here is really good and definitely, a high point of this film. The score here is really weird. The score itself is fine, but the soundtrack is a very strange choice. There's a lot of hip-hop music in this movie, and at no point does it really feel like it fits here. Not only that, they have this weird recurring gag with these birds that will almost serve as, like, narrators telling you recapping events that have happened in the movie, and it was just a really strange choice overall. I don't understand this movie's obsession with A Tribe Called Quest. I like A Tribe Called Quest a lot. Very good band, for sure. And nobody is disputing that, but I don't think anyone listens to that music and says, hey, this should be in a Tom and Jerry movie. You know where this would be applicable? Tom and Jerry. That's where we want to see it. Like, I just don't think anyone is really doing that, so I just found that to be a very strange choice overall. And the editing, I don't think this film is actually terribly paced. I wasn't necessarily bored during this movie. A lot of it I was just kind of watching, but I do think there are definitely some moments that do go on a bit too long. I think definitely the moments with Tom and Jerry especially are really well put together, but everything else is just kind of fine in terms of editing. And honestly, this film proved to me what I've always known, that Tom and Jerry just does not work as a feature-length film. The reason why Tom and Jerry is so good is because they are 7-minute shorts, and they work as that. They work in small doses, but after a while, it really does start to get annoying. I mean, I watched 2 Tom and Jerry movies after this one. I watched the one where they talk, which is all kinds of horrible, because why the fuck would you ever want to do that? But then I watched another one, which was classic Tom and Jerry. It's called Tom and Jerry The Magic Ring, and you think it would be a lot of fun, but after a while, it just gets rather repetitive. And I think the thing is, Tom and Jerry, as fun as they are, again, it just doesn't really work as a feature film. There just isn't enough to go off of, and I understand the temptation to add in other stuff because of that. I do. but you gotta make it more interesting than it is here. You really have to do that, and the film just doesn't. It makes the story here is just so generic and so by the numbers, and at no point do you really care about what's going on. You really only care when Tom and Jerry are involved with it, and the film just doesn't really do much to get you to care about really anything else that's going on, and it just makes the film honestly kind of boring at points, and I think that's definitely where the film does fall flat for sure. Overall, Tom and Jerry is just really just kind of fine. There isn't really a lot of other ways to describe it. It's not one of the worst hybrid, live-action hybrid animated films out there. It does actually stick to the source material of what made Tom and Jerry great. It does have some legitimately really fun sequences from both of them, but when it veers away from that and focuses on these human characters, it really just bogs the film down and makes it feel very forgettable in that way. It's not terrible. I've definitely seen far worse films out there, but overall, it's just not really anything that great either, and especially with the dozens of films we've gotten, I definitely feel like there needs to be a better way to make these. There's definitely more that you could do here, and I just wish that they would focus on that. I wish they would really look at what people are saying and find ways to make it better, find ways to make these films more inherently likable, but they just aren't really doing that, and as a result, this film just feels very overly familiar in that way. So I'm going to give Tom and Jerry overall a C. Over guys, my review of Tom and Jerry. Let me know what you guys saw this moral of your thoughts, and we'll see you guys in my next video, and we'll see you guys for that. Okay, bye.